In this video, we'll have a look at a couple of these specialized connective tissues. Now, one we want to have a look at is bone. Now, bone's an interesting one. Yes, it falls under the category of connective tissues. It's an interesting one because its extracellular matrix is quite different than the others, as you can probably imagine. So the extracellular matrix is about 35% organic components. And really, what is this? This is largely things like collagen fibers and ground substance. And that we often refer to as the osteoid material. Now, that leaves about 65%, which is not accounted for. And this is inorganic. Now, what is it? It's inorganic calcium phosphate crystals. So it's basically calcium salts. And this is what really makes bone such a hard, durable substance. Now, the one thing we have to remember is that usually in the anatomy lab, when we see bones, we're either, if they're real bones, they're desiccated, they're dead, they're dried out. But we got to remember that in real life, bone is a very dynamic tissue that is able to remodel itself. And it'll remodel itself after injury. It'll remodel itself if stresses on the bone do change, so an increase in activity, etc. Now, we start looking at bone, we'll start to see some cells that take on the word, the first part of the word is osteo. So we have osteoblasts, osteocytes. And these are very important cells that are involved in the creation of bone and the maintaining of bone. So, let's start off with osteoblasts. So if there's increased tension, we can have osteoblasts become activated. Now, osteoblasts lay down bone matrix and have a role in bone deposition. Now, there's another group of cells. So remember, I said there's osteoblasts, and osteoblasts create the matrix once they're trapped in a lacunae. This is going to sound familiar. Sounds very much like what we talked about with when we looked at cartilage, where there were lacunae and cells within it. But here what happens is osteoblasts lay down the matrix. There are lacunae, and the osteoblasts then transform into osteocytes within there. Now, there's another group of cells which actually come from a very different part, different cell line, different part of the body, which are osteoclasts. And they're involved with breaking down and reabsorption of bone. So let's just quickly walk through that again. There's three cells that begin with the word, or with the first part of the name is osteo. Osteoblasts build bone material. Once they're trapped in their lacunae in the matrix, they are now osteocytes, which help to maintain the bone. And they do a few other activities, and we'll talk more about when we actually get to the bone chapters. And then there's osteoclasts, which break down bone and help with remodeling. Now, the osteoblasts, as I said, are the bone builders. Where do we find them? The outer surface of the bone, and they're closely associated with this dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue, which we call the periosteum. Now, they carry out, as I said, bone deposition, synthesis, and they also help to secrete the organic extracellular matrix. And they do have a role in terms of calcium being trapped within the extracellular matrix. Osteocytes, as I said, it's when osteoblasts surround themselves with extracellular matrix. We find them within the lacunae and mostly inactive, but that's not to be taken that they're always inactive, because they do continue to make and secrete substances that are important for bone maintenance and bone health. And they may have a role in sort of signaling and sort of determining the stresses that are on bone and whether we should add more bone or take away bone. Then we have osteoclasts. Now, these are interesting. These are large, multinucleated bone destroyers that they actually will help to dissolve and break down bone. And they're involved in a process that we call bone reabsorption. And what do? They actually secrete hydrogen ions And these hydrogen ions actually attract then chloride ions, and we have a little bit of hydrochloric acid in there. And we also have enzymes that break down both the inorganic and the organic extracellular matrix. We'll come back to this story when we really start talking about bones in the subsequent bone chapters. Let's just have a look. So here is a typical presentation of a section of bone. And this is a compact bone, and we can see there's this system called an osteon. And this is a central canal. Now you got to remember, this is a cross section. This is a central canal where basically blood vessels and blood vessels would run through it. And then what we have here, these are the lacunae. So that's where the osteocytes live, in the lacunae. And you can see in this type of bone, it gets laid down in concentric circles, almost like the rings of a tree. As we're looking at this, we can see a few more things. We can see that there's these fine little lines, which are little canals that connect the various lacunae. In between, we have calcified extracellular matrix. As I said, we have these are lacunae, and inside those would be osteocytes. Now, if we actually look at bone tissue at sort of more of the periphery, we can see that there is osteocytes in the lacunae, bone in the extracellular matrix, and we can see there's osteoblasts that are on the periphery of the bone, up in the area called the periosteum. Now let's have a look at another type of specialized connective tissue, and that is blood. And it's very unique because its extracellular matrix is a fluid. Now what do I find in its extracellular matrix? I find the plasma proteins. Things like albumin we find in there, right? And we'll talk about more of this when we get to the blood chapter. And you already know from previous courses that, of course, the role of blood is transportation of substances. Everything from oxygen to carbon dioxide to hormones to various nutrients, waste products, etc. And also it has a role in blood clotting. We have different types of formed elements. And let me introduce that term. Formed elements refer to the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Now, why don't we just call these all the blood cells? Because technically platelets are not cells. So when we talk about all three of these together, we really refer to them as formed elements. So the formed elements are the erythrocytes, which are the red blood cells, and you know they carry oxygen, CO2, etc. White blood cells, the leukocytes, and they have a large role in immunity. Once again, we talk about that in future chapters. And we have platelets. And of course, one of the major roles of platelets is in blood clotting. And we can have a look here. We can see the ARS diagram. We can see the typical red blood cells, the erythrocytes. And then we can see various white blood cells. Now, these are all different types of white blood cells. And once again, when we get to the blood chapter, we'll be starting to identify things such as lymphocytes versus some of the other types of white blood cells.